Oh boy, here we go. See, this is one of the stuff that I do know that it's easy to edit out the beginning and the end, not the effort to edit out the middle. So I can goof off a little at the very beginning here, just chop that off the recording. Although why bother? Yes, I arranged the seats so that people would have places to seat today.
Yes, I'm waiting for the seat.
Well, the good news is by it, you can reorganize anything as you want. Choose however you wish.
Presbyterians sit in the back, right?
That's correct. Presbyterians sit in the back. I'm now using that joke all the time. So right now, one of the problems I'm facing is I had as part of my work, I ran a big tour of Joint Base Andrews, the air base, on Friday, talking about environmental issues there. And I had all kinds of people from all kinds of government agencies there. Although the people I really wanted to speak to, which are the people who plan the base, and they're working on all these big new projects for the base, none of them showed up. I got guys from NASA, I got guys from all USGS, I got guys from all over, but none of the people who I'm really trying to speak to. Anyway, I had all these people there. And so I was about 4 hours of ranting. As somebody goes, you're very passionate about your work. I'm like, yes, it's a passion driven by hate. My hatred of the Environmental Protection Agency, but I tend to talk loud so I can project it. So my voice is recovering. You have to apologize. So here we are on week 3. We're going to talk about the secret gospels of the Gnostics. And yes, recording is now in progress. That means do not use any bad words, or I will have to edit this. All right. For those who are online or listening to this recording, because as far as I can tell at this moment, no one's online, just grab your, let's pretend, grab your caffeinated beverage of choice. Pretend it's Woody's Fair Trade Blend. It's pretty good. It's strong today. Take your socially distanced seat in the back of the classroom in good Presbyterian fashion. Look to the whiteboard for the terrible dumb joke. Noah was a great financier. He floated his stock while everyone else's assets were being liquidated. Boom. And now let's move on to an actual Bible verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome him. I want you guys to keep a little bit of what's in this passage in mind as we get near to the end of the class, because of the 4 gospels, the Gospel of John is the most similar. You could start reading Gnostic trends and issues. It's a reach, but it's there. So our much dreaded agenda, opening prayer. I don't know how much of a check-in we'll have with just this small crowd. Caveats and disclaimers, the schedule, which is really easy. This is the last class. The not so quick review of what we talked over the last 2 weeks. Again, Christianity all over the place, and Gnostics and their texts. So here we go again. Say it with me. Dear Lord, even though Bill is teaching us, may we please learn something of value. Amen. All right. This is my work, by the way, herding cats. That's what I do for a living right now. It's here. Everybody here knows everybody, right? All right, we're skipping this. All right, the goofball teaching this class is just a geologist and only knows dirt, rocks, and water. All other information is suspect. Why don't you like school? We don't read about dinosaurs. Yeah. Okay, also, we're going to talk about Neoplatonism, a school of philosophy today. And I can tell you right now, I don't get it. There are going to be words up there, and to me, sometimes it's word salad. So, asking me to explain the finer points of Neoplatonism, it isn't going to happen. All right. But for the rest, you can relax because there will be no geology today. So. And again, when I talk about conventional understanding or conventional convention in my class, I'm meaning it in an academic sense, and a traditional understanding or traditional history, that is the religious traditions that we built on over the years. So for example, there's a specific location in Israel underneath a former abbey, if I remember correctly, where there's some flagstones. And it's a traditional location where people believe that Jesus, it was one of the streets that Jesus carried the cross. And so it's a pilgrimage location. But historians, so traditionally that's what that is, but historians argue, no, we can tell that this part of the road was built much later. And it's probably not a place where Jesus actually walked, but oh well. All right, so we've already gone, the emperor holds the convention. Last week we talked about who or what is Q and why is he or they writing the Gospel of Thomas. And this week, the secret Gospels of the Gnostics. This is the last class of this session. At the very tail end, when I show up a picture of a cute military working dog, we can talk at least briefly about what we're going to do in the future, because I don't know. Again, the sources that I'm reaching into is The Fall of Pagans and the Origins of Medieval Christianity by Kenneth W. Barrow. And when you start looking at these texts, these guys do not talk about the Gnostic texts, but they do talk about the Q source, the Gospel of Thomas, and the texts of the Synoptic Gospels. That's where I'm pulling this stuff out of. So let's do a not so quick review, or I'll try to get through a review as quickly as I can. We have this battle. It's one of the many civil wars, except this battle was won by Constantine. And prior to the battle, he had a vision, a dream. It said that by this symbol, the Cairo symbol, you will conquer. And so he put that symbol on his troop shields. That was the banner he marched under, and he won a great victory. So when God comes and says, by this symbol, you will win, suddenly you have a belief in that God. That's evidence. We get all of this information from Eusebius of Caesarea, who was bishop of Caesarea from 314 to roughly around 340, who is a church historian and theologian, and he wrote lots and lots of books, and we still have the copies of these texts now. And so a lot of our traditional church history from this time comes from the writings of Eusebius of Caesarea, and he writes a lot about Constantine. So again, that Cairo symbol is a Christogram. It's a combination of the first two letters of Christos in Greek, the Chi and the Rho symbol. So Constantine now formally recognizes Christianity as one of the valid religions. It's no longer illegal to be a Christian. Prior to Constantine, Christianity was viewed by official Rome as being a superstition and not a religion. But he formally recognizes it as a religion. And not only does he formally recognize it as a religion, because he's now becoming converted to becoming a Christianity, and because he's being influenced by the bishops of the apostolic churches, they establish an entire layer of government that's filled by Christians. That layer of government is now actively preaching against traditional Roman religion, what we now call as paganism. And so I have got another book that I've been reading called The Rise of Paganism, and it talks about the weird juxtaposition that paganism, in a sense, rose with Christianity, because nobody called traditional Roman religion, practitioners of traditional Roman polytheistic religion, as pagans. That was a derisive term by Christians. So when Christians get in charge, they start preaching against paganism. Well, there was no paganism until they became in charge. So in a sense, paganism rose with Christianity. But anyway, now we call all those kind of polytheistic religions of the time, including the Norse and these polytheistic pantheonic religions, as paganism. but the term pagan is kind of a derisive term. But anyway, so the book is called The Rise of Paganism, and what it's talking about is the rise of Christianity and the decrease of the influence of traditional Roman religion. So Constantine then, the best and the brightest, that's the major change that occurs under Constantine, is that prior to Constantine, if you wanted to get ahead in Roman government, one of the major things you did as a Roman citizen with ambition is support traditional Roman religion. You didn't just go to the religious services, you hosted them. You were expected as a civic leader, as a major leader of to be there, to do stuff, to pay for things, these games, these community, Roman traditional religion, their rituals were conducted at the temple. You would go to the temple and offer sacrifices, so on and so forth. But they had major festivals that were civic actions taken by the whole city, and everybody was expected to participate. Games, celebrations, things along that line. And the leading lights of the civic structure are the ones who paid for that stuff. If you were a patron, you were a leader in the city, this is one of the ways that you got ahead in the world, is by hosting games, hosting festivals and paying for all this stuff. And everybody was expected to show up, and there was ceremonies that go on and things along that line to the gods, sacrifices. The leading lights were expected to conduct these sacrifices, so on and so forth. And Christians wouldn't participate. And that's why they're being ostracized or persecuted, is because in the sense of the Roman religion, everybody's expected to show up at the town square and do stuff, have a celebration, have a festival, so on and so forth. And if a group of people don't show up and participate, and then the volcano goes off next door and kills you, whose fault is it? It's those guys who didn't show up and participate. They made the gods angry. So anyway, well, this all changed. Now, if you wanted to get ahead, you became a Christian. And instead of participating in the Roman traditional religion, you ranted and raved against this foul pagans. So anyway, all right, but Christianity in this time was all over the place. We had all these different types of Christianity. But the one form of Christianity that was probably the most influential, and certainly the form that Constantine took a hold of, is the form that we now view as Orthodox Christianity, the Christianity that was being taught in the apostolic churches. So the forms of Christianity that we know about at the time, there was some called adoptionism, where they believed that Jesus was a human being, but was not really begotten by God. He was adopted by God. It's like, Pokemon, I choose you. Docetism, Jesus's physical body was never physical. It was all just illusion. He's a spiritual being, some kind of ghostly thing. The Ebionites argued that if you were going to be a Christian, you had to be a Jew, because if Jesus was Jewish, you had to be Jewish. And if you read texts like Mark and Matthew, Jesus says stuff like, I'm here only for the children of Israel, so on and so forth. So make sure you're a child of Israel. You got to be kosher and all that stuff. Marcionism, we're going to talk about that because it has similarities to the Gnostic faith. And then others, of course, including Gnosticism. So in order to help sort all this out, Constantine calls for the Council of Nicaea to establish unified church doctrine, and it ends up being based upon the traditions of the apostolic churches. And what they're actually arguing about was Arianism, a specific form of who was Jesus. So the apostolic churches are the theological backbone of what we now call modern Christianity or Orthodox Christianity. And we're all, in a certain sense, Orthodox Christians because we believe in a triune God, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, all packaged up in some kind of nebulous that I still have a hard time wrapping my head around. Also, the apostolic churches are very much influenced by the writings of Paul. which you can see in our New Testament. You got the four Gospels, and then you got the book of Acts. At some point in time, the book of Acts changes from the Acts of Peter and the original apostles and just starts doing nothing but talking about Paul, right? And then you got the epistles of Paul, who's, and in many senses, his letters to the churches, his epistles, are the oldest extant Christian texts. They probably predate in time the actual writings of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So these are a lot of these early churches that were established by Paul, Paul's followers, or the other apostles and their followers. So by the time we had the Council of Nicaea, I always learned that the Council of Nicaea is where they hammered down what the New Testament was. And then when I start actually digging into it, it turns out that's not true. Oh gosh, I hate it when my misconceptions are wrong. Finding out I'm wrong has been happening with a great deal of regularity of late. And it's really hard on my big, large, bloated ego. No, it turns out by the Council of Nicaea, if you read the writings of Eusebius of Caesarea, they already had a good idea of their head what the canonized text is. Just nobody's actually sat down and said, this is the Bible. Yet that occurs about a generation after the Council of Nicaea. But if you look at what he says, it's like following, the four Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, the epistles, so on and so forth. It reads very much like our current New Testament. Okay, so that's what the Council of Nicaea is. I'm going to skip the part where we talked all about the Nicene Creed and how it is in many ways a direct refutation of all of the other various doctrines out there. And then last week we got into the Synoptic Gospels and how we look at the texts. We have Mark has 76% that's shared with the other texts. Luke is 41%. Matthew is 46%. That's the shared narrative. There's very little that's just in Mark and Luke, and there's very little that's in just Mark and Matthew. You've got quite a bit that's unique to Matthew, and even more that's unique to Luke, if you look at it. So some folks have come together with the argument, there's no real evidence for this other than logic, so to speak, that maybe there was a different gospel out there at one point in time, a document that's lost to us, or maybe it wasn't even written down. It was just a narrative collection of sayings of Jesus that were being relayed to congregation via oral tradition. But they refer to this as the Q gospel or the Q source. The Q is short first letter for Quella, which is German for source. It turns out that the Germans scholars were the first to start thinking about this concept. A lot of our textual analysis of the Bible comes out of a German tradition, including our textual analysis of the Old Testament into various sources, priestly sources, kingly sources. It's the Germans who first took a look at the earliest translations of Genesis and go, how come in some places they refer to God as God, God is the Lord, and God is Yahweh? And then they started, well, maybe the guys who talked about God as God, the Father, that's one source. God is the Lord is another source. And the guys who refer to Yahweh that's a third source. And, that kind of analysis. But anyway, so the Q sources, it argues that Luke and Matthew had access to the second source, and blending that source with Mark is how they constructed their versions of the text. And suddenly it's easier to construct the two texts. And then when you go, well, if that's the case, where do you have any other evidence? And the only evidence that we really have is the Gospel of Thomas. We do have a fully or close to a fully extant version of the Gospel of Thomas in an archaeological form, so to speak. It's in Coptic. It was probably originally written in Greek. It's translated into Coptic, which is an Egyptian, the form of Egyptian that was spoken in the early part of our first, second, and third century. And it's not much more than a structured list of the sayings of Jesus. It's not really a true narrative. But in that sense, if you start looking at Thomas, we start thinking it starts aligning much with this hypothetical Q source. And so the idea is that the Gospel of Thomas was also pulling from whatever Q was. Now, our version of the Gospel of Thomas came from the Nag Hammadi Library, which is a group of sealed jars found out in the desert by a farmer in 1945. Apparently, after Constantine got in charge and you started establishing the Orthodox faith as the faith du jour, and then within a generation or two, it became the official religion of the Roman government. And then if you're Orthodox and you're in charge, what's the thing that you can do if you're the official government religion? You start cracking down on that heresy, right? Not just go, you heretic. It's like, you heretic. Go get them. You know, judges and people and police and persecutions and, you know, all the good stuff that we start reaching into them and, you know, burning them at the stake. I don't know how much burning at the stake occurred during Roman times. But the point is that apparently somebody gathered together these texts that they felt was important. They were undergoing persecution by the Orthodox Christians. So they gathered together these texts, sealed them in jars, and then hid them in the desert, hopefully to preserve them and keep them from being burned by those Orthodox book burners, and then promptly lost them or something, and they were found centuries later by some farmer. We also find in terms, yeah, finding 3 jars with old books inside. So the other thing that has occurred from this point in time, or we get our other shreds of texts. For example, we do not have a fully extant copy of the Gospel of Mary that everybody's, the Gospel of Mary, so on and so forth is all ranting about. We only have fragments of it. Where are these fragments coming from? These are coming from archaeological sites where there's been scroll dumps, usually found outside of religious communities. And there are documents where somebody screwed up when they're writing a scroll or something along that line on papyrus. They're almost always in Coptic. They're almost always found in Egypt, and then was thrown out in the garbage. And then archaeologists dig up the garbage. And what do they get? They get bits and pieces of these scrolls that people were copying. And then, oops, I spilled the ink or something. And then they throw it out, start over again. So what about these Gnostic texts? Some of the Gnostic texts, there are many more of them. The secret book of James, the Gospel of Peter, the secret book of John, the Apocalypse, that is the revelation of Paul, the Apocalypse of James, the Apocalypse of Adam, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas. Those are the 2 famous ones that have been make their way through the media over the last couple of decades, and many others. Which leads us to the topic du jour today. Gnosticism. Okay, here's the problem number 1. We know almost nothing really about Gnostic faith. Why? Because they were heretics. And so when they wrote stuff and the Orthodox Apostolic Church tradition got a hold of it, they got rid of it. So that's 1. We don't know much about them. What do we know about them? Well, the only thing we do really know about them is what other people were writing about them and who were writing about them. It was the Orthodox Apostolic Church saying why these guys were so bad. You believe what these idiot Gnostics believe. So that's what we hear. Our understanding of Gnosticism is through the lens of criticism of our church fathers. But this has been expanded on in the last century or so, now that we're actually starting to get copies or portions of copies of Gnostic texts. So that helps a little bit with us trying to understand what the Gnostics were believing. So what do we do know? Well, first of all, this whole term Gnostic is a label that's been applied to the people who practiced or believed these belief systems by historians. It's not that the Gnostics ran around, are you a Gnostic? Are you one of me? you one of us? No, they didn't talk about, we're not sure if they ever actually referred to themselves as other than being Christians or some form of Christian or something along that line. This is a label we've added on to them. So they didn't refer to themselves as being Gnostic. We get this term Gnostic and the idea of knowledge. That's the Greek word for gnosis. What we do understand is that the believers emphasize the importance of their own spiritual knowledge, gnosis, over the orthodox teachings of the apostolic church. To a certain extent, maybe one of the reasons we're having such a hard time getting our heads around what the Gnostics believed is because maybe every Gnostic believed something completely different. Well, I see what the Bible tells me, but in my heart, I believe this other thing. And that's my own spiritual knowledge. Maybe that's what's happening. We're not sure. So from this point on, it gets really hard for us to understand. Yeah, that's me trying to figure out how I fit in the universe. Okay, so a couple of key concepts that we do think we understand from the Gnostics. By reading through the text of people being critical of Gnostics, we think that the Gnostics believe that each of us carried some spark, some portion of spiritual energy, some part of God within us. And that Jesus was sent by God to help us find this spiritual knowledge of God within us, so to speak. And if this kind of confuses you, then welcome to the club. It kind of confuses me too. So some people argue that the Gnostics were trying to obtain a sense of themselves in a spiritual sense and completely divest themselves away from the material. In that sense, some people argue that the Gnostics were similar to the Buddhists. We got to stop thinking about ourselves in this gross material manner and flesh and start becoming spiritual beings. And Jesus is here to lead the way. But we have to mix these guys in. Neoplatonism. The Neoplatonists were a group of philosophers in the 1st century who were expanding on the philosophical works of Plato. And they developed the concept of the one. In other words, there's this nebulous one. Think of it as God. This one is the source. And then there's a separate being, part of the one, but not the one, called the demiurge. And then they argue that there's a further separation of our intellect and our soul. Well, they're two different beings. Our soul is like our essence. Our intellect is our combined memories. They're trying to parse out in a philosophical sense. Almost what they're trying to do is explain religion through philosophy. And let's face it, I don't understand any of it. I'm a geologist. I know about faults. So let's take a brief moment and meet Marcion of Sinope. And this particular document shows a picture of Marcion sitting with St. Peter, supposedly having a discussion. Marcion was a leader of a group of early Christians during the 2nd century. And we know a lot more about Marcion than we do about the Gnostics. He was excommunicated by the Bishop of Rome in 144, and then he went on to lead his community in Asia Minor, what we now know as Turkey. And although he was not a Gnostic, because we understand a bit more about what he actually wrote his own. Marcion actually developed the first quote unquote New Testament. It's not our New Testament, because the first thing he put in it is the gospel according to Marcion. But he developed this is it. This is the Bible. This is the New Testament. And of course, the gospel of Marcion. you actually look at the Gospel of Marcion, it reads a lot like the Gospel of Luke. It's just redacted a lot more. So it's not all that controversial, but other than the fact it says the Gospel of Marcion at the top. He is not Gnostic. He argues that, like the guys who argue that Jesus was a spiritual, ethereal type being, an illusion, there was not a creature of the flesh. He doesn't argue that we carry some part of God within us that seems to be a core portion of the Gnostic faith. But he does have one thing in common, that our understanding of where Gnostics look at the world come from Marcion, and that is this idea of the one and the demiurge, and that there are two gods. Okay, now you can see right now, if I'm a Gnostic and I come up to an Orthodox bishop and go, so how many gods are there? Well, there's one. There's one triune God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, but that's one God. No, there's two. You might have a problem. Okay, trying to reach a breach, some negotiated understanding between the two. That's a wide gulf to try to reach across.
Is
So
that one of the Old Testament and the one of the New Testament?
Correct. So the idea is that you have this greater being, this great God, this one, the source, and then you have this lesser God, which they associate in Neoplatonism. This is why I can't record stuff. Because if I'm recording it not live, I'd be hitting the button, I'd be going back and then trying to say Neoplatonism and not tripping over my tongue 900 times, as opposed to you guys having to listen to me, struggle with my dyslexia. The demiurge is what the Neoplatonists would argue this lesser God is. So the idea is actually, in a sense, it's quite logical. This lesser God, this demiurge, the God, the creator, created the world per the Old Testament, 7 days and so on. But this God is either A, flawed, or some would argue even a malevolent being, because that God screwed up. It's obvious God screwed up when he created the world because we're all miserable. What are we doing? We're beating each other up. We're unhappy all the time. We're starving. We're dying of thirst. We're being killed by earthquakes. We're getting sick. Are we happy? No. Obviously, God screwed up. Yeah. What happens? Like at some point in time, don't we all ask ourselves that? So we're trying to figure out why the universe is the universe, why good things or bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people, and so on and so forth. So, well, the explanation is, turns out, according to the Gnostic idea, is super easy. God screwed up. God is an inferior God. God botched the job. Okay, so now how can God botch the job and still be God? Because God's supposed to be all good and all powerful and so on and so forth, and he can't botch the job. So the idea, well, it can't be God, it has to be a lesser God, a messed up God. So God botched things, and now we're stuck with this material world, and Jesus was sent by the real God, the source, the one, to help save us from the botched God's attempt. That's the core belief system of Marcionism. And so we understand that this is the same kind of belief system that the Gnostics had. Now, what we don't understand is, did Marcion learn this idea from Gnostics of his time and grab onto it? Or did the Gnostics grab onto what Marcion was saying? Who came up with this stuff? I don't know. But Marcion never claimed that we have some kind of spiritual part of us, God within us. That was not part of his faith. So many people consider it. Some people say, well, look at this his origin idea, this duality, this dual God kind of situation. He must have been a Gnostic. And others go, no. The Gnostics believe this. Marcion had some stuff in that were similar, but it wasn't really. I'm not sure we're even in. We know so little about the Gnostics, it gets a little hard to talk about. So we think that the Gnostics were attempting to reach some form of mystical state that actually connect to that part of God within themselves. That was the goal, to separate themselves from the material world, become immersed in the spiritual world, and grow and understand, reach a state of gnosis or knowledge of their own spiritual innerness. And so often people refer to this as a form of mysticism. Kind of, but I even have a hard time from divine mysticism. I don't know. It's not dirt, rocks, or water. I'm running out. Can't help it. So, but in other words, you could say they're attempting to know God. And so there's many other religions like that, Buddhism being one of them. For you ultimately want to reach a state of nirvana, right? Where you don't care anymore about the material world. You've reached a higher level. So we do have a few, in many places, it's just scraps, because we're finding them in skull dumps, Gnostic Gospels. And it turns out that through an analysis, there's a certain trend that runs through most of the Gnostic Gospels. So they read differently than the older, I use orthodox in quotations because the term orthodox doesn't really come into real play until after the Council of Nicaea. All right, you get everybody together and you go, oh, wait, this is it. We, the group of Christians of the Apostolic Church and tradition, believe this. That becomes the cornerstone of what we refer to as orthodox. Then everyone else is now a heretic. But so, and I use orthodox in quotation because we now consider these orthodox. But during the 1st and 2nd century, they weren't quote unquote orthodox. They were just the books that were being referred to by the majority of the apostolic churches. Are you guys following any of this, or am I? Kathy's giving me some perplexed looks, and I apologize. Huh?
I'm a step behind, but I'm getting.
Okay. Now, so the Gnostic Gospels do not read like, we have Luke, Jesus was born. Here's some conversations around, you have this narrative story. The Gnostic Gospels read quite a bit differently. For example, the Gospel of Mary. The Gospel of Mary, from the shreds that we have of the Gospel of Mary, has Jesus talking to starts off with Jesus talking to his assembly of apostles, including Mary. And he's having a discussion of spirit and faith. And then he leaves and everyone's unhappy. Like, did you understand what he just said? He's made them uncomfortable. So then they turn to Mary and ask her questions because she's the most beloved of Jesus. And then she says, I had this vision and I talked to Jesus about it. And this is the vision I had. And he said that was correct. And then she discusses how that when the spirit leaves the body and works its way through heaven, it has to go through 4 trials. Okay, something along that line. And we don't have a whole lot of the text. But the point is that instead of being the story of the life of Jesus, it's like a narrative snapshot in time, or a group of snapshots in time that may talk about discussions with Jesus. And then it always leads to the end of some big revelation. The spirit will have to undergo 4 trials before, it makes its way to heaven, or some others kind of revelation. Yes.
Is Mary, is that supposed to be Mary Magdalene or the mother of Jesus, or do we know?
We do not know. So some historians going back over it goes, it's supposed to be attributed to Mary, mother of Jesus. Others argue it's Mary Magdalene. Others is there another Mary out there? That kind of thing. And then real historian, I shouldn't say that, real historians, it's the wrong word. I said it again. Conventional historians argue it wasn't written by any of them. was written by a different anonymous author at a later time and then attributed their text to being that of Mary. Now, presumably, if we had the full text, we would figure out which Mary it was attributed to. But that's one of the leading arguments of the early church fathers and by scholars now, is that these Gnostic texts were not written by any of the people that they're attributed to. They would all argue to a certain extent they're forgeries, frauds. But so there's these narrative stories of Jesus that lead to some kind of form of revelation at the end of the scripture. Usually something regarding the nature of spirit or the soul or the spark of inner godness within you that you're trying to reach out to. And these texts are often being referred to as being the hidden texts or the secret text. We saw some of that in the So notable texts that have made it in the mainstream media of late are texts like the Gospel of Mary that claims Mary, and again, I put in question marks which one, because it's not really clearly explained, was the most beloved of all the apostles. And then people have made the leap from there. Well, it must be Mary Magdalene. If she was the most beloved, then she obviously must have been married to Christ. He got hitched. And then so other people have taken the next, well, if he got married, they had sex. What does sex lead to? Babies. And then you can take that leap further. Oh, there's a tradition that Mary Magdalene fled to southern France. It's a tradition in southern France. Maybe she brought the baby with her. And well, anyway, that's all. I have a whole presentation on the Da Vinci Code. Turns out the Da Vinci Code is a series of misunderstandings and shenanigans right from the get-go that Dan Brown made a whole bunch of money off of. And the one part that he can walk away pristine with is like, it's just fiction. What do you want? Including the guys who sued him for plagiarism. He's like, the judge, I can almost, I wasn't, I haven't read the court proceedings or anything. You can almost see the judge going, okay, you guys who wrote the blood and yeah, that one. The guys who wrote, are you claiming your book is fiction or nonfiction? And they're like, our book is nonfiction. You gathered the evidence, is scholarly done. Dan Brown, is your book fiction or nonfiction? My book is fiction. How can you claim that he's plagiarizing your work if he says his stuff is fiction and yours is not? So yeah, he lost the lawsuit, the plagiarism lawsuit. Had Dan Brown claimed, no, mine's pieces of scholarly work and it's all original, then yeah, you can make an argument it's plagiarism. But he's not arguing that it's like, this is just fiction. Am I pulling from ideas from these other guys? Sure. If anything, those guys sold more books because of his book, then they shouldn't have been suing him. They should have been going, blah, blah, let's bank on this. Anyway, there's the Gospel of Mary, and then there's the Gospel of Judas, which if you read through the text indicates that Judas was actually the bestest of the apostles and agreed to take the fall to allow Jesus to get captured so that he could go through the whole dying on the cross and the resurrection thing. Jesus took him aside and look, I gotta die. I gotta be sacrificed. I have to be the blood of the lamb and the whole thing. And it isn't gonna work unless we get the soldiers to show up and haul me before the Sanhedrin. Since you, Judas, are my bestest buddy of all of the apostles, I need you to bite the bullet, become the traitor, go down there and turn me in so we can get the ball rolling here. I got to go through I got to go through the horrible misery of the crucifixion before I can come back in 3 days. That's what the Gospel of Judas. Of course, nobody buying that. Anyway. So most of the texts. There's a spelling error. Most of the gospel of these Gnostic gospels were written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And of course, they're definitely not included in our New Testament, nor were they included in Marcion's New Testament when he said, Marcion's New Testament in many ways reads a lot like ours, except for the inclusion of the Gospel of Marcion. So how is Gnosticism practiced? We don't really know, but we get a sense from reading the texts that the idea is that there was a master, or somebody who claimed to be a master or teacher, somebody who had already reached this state of gnosis. They in turn would gather 1 or 2 or maybe a small cadre of individuals with which they would then relate these secret texts to and try to teach them what they needed to know to reach gnosis within themselves. And what do we think that might be? What is that? The cynic in me and in others, and including the church fathers. Oh, here comes the guy with the snow job. Oh yes, I've reached great spiritual. I'm there already. You mean, hey, tell you what, for a small amount of money, I can help you on your spiritual journey. It reminds me of televangelists. Hence my diagram. Remember the 80s, the televangelism? The bigger the hair, the closer to God. So I got 10 minutes left. Anybody have questions that I probably am completely unqualified to answer?
I have a question.
Sure.
Years ago, I read a book by Nagel about the Gospel of Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
But is there a Gospel of Thomas that people can read?
I don't know, but I believe there is. I believe it's been translated. Let me try to dig that up. Because I believe that the Coptic version of the Gospel of Thomas that they found in Egypt is almost complete.
Oh, well.
That's my understanding, at least. I will go digging.
Well, that was my understanding from reading
Yeah.
about it, but I expected to read more of it.
I'll have to see if somebody's got to have translated it at some point in time. It's probably really boring. Jesus said, probably reads like, a Confucian. Confucius says, anyway. So. Any other questions? I can do some digging. That's the best I can do. I got too wrapped up in reading, because I am that much. The nerd in me should be immediately, what? I should get a copy of the Gospel of Thomas and actually read it. Because the works of Josephus, those are translated back in the 1700s, and they're now out of copyright. So you can get a complete work of the Jewish history, the Jewish wars, and all, which is a leading source for our understanding of historical Jesus. That's like $30 now. The book is like because there's no copyright. Anyway, there's no audible version. Yes.
The slide that you have that has like the list of different beliefs, the one that's like Gnosticism, it was first to begin.
Yeah. The same slide I keep
Yes,
using
that
over and
one.
over. Oop, oop.
That one.
Yeah.
Are those, can you equate those to any faith traditions now? Like, are those beliefs that have carried through to our present day, or have they kind of all been abandoned?
I think some of these have carried through, but in very small groups. So the Nestorian tradition of Christianity does not believe in a triune God. It's more equated to Arianism.
Okay.
Jesus is the Son, Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus was the Son of God, so on and so forth, but he's still separate from God. This whole God, Holy Spirit, Jesus all being one thing, that doesn't make intellectual sense. We're all part of God. God sends out the Holy Spirit to do stuff, and Jesus is the Son of God and the Messiah sent to save us. sacrificed, and through his grace, we're all saved. All of that stuff's fine, but this idea of them all being one triune God thing doesn't fit in a Nestorian tradition. There's another tradition that's, if there's any still left, given what's been happening in the Middle East of late, called Mahdiism, which is a small branch of Christian faith. And then I don't remember which one of these versions they're tied into, but there are still pockets that may have reached back to some of these traditions. I want to say that Mahdiism is tied into this more like a Gnostic type faith. As I was piling stuff in there, I stumbled across it. Mahdiism. Some part of me goes, I think I've heard of this before, but I can't remember. And I didn't have time to dig deeper. Nothing? Okay, so I am not teaching next month. Oop, there's Ronnie.
Aw.
Isn't he a happy dog? I put this on the end of my presentation for my tour yesterday, and I had to run my presentation through the lawyers because I was talking about some very controversial stuff. And the lawyer was ripping me a new one. My lawyer, the way I work with, is a very harsh human being. It's great when she's working for you. It sucks when she's working against you. I've seen her tear apart attorneys in their, guy comes up in the Armani double breast power suit from New York, and she's a little mousy woman from San Antonio. Yeah, that's my attorney. Woo! But on other times, like on Wednesday, when she was ripping my presentation to bits. So she ripped all this stuff to bits. In the very last comment, she goes, is Ronnie really a happy dog? If that guy told that dog to rip your arm off, it would. So is it really appropriate to put a picture of a happy dog? So anyway, there's my lawyer's caveat. He may be a happy dog in this picture, but still, the guy there could probably tell Ronnie to rip your arm off. Yeah, he may be happy. Ronnie may be very happy. So in my presentation, I replaced Ronnie with a picture of Tio sporting his, they give the dogs little medals after they do their 10 years before they retire. They get a little Air Force accommodation. They wear them on their collar and they get the picture taken. And then they retire. They're almost always adopted by various Air Force handlers who also have retired, probably worked with them at one point in time or the other, and that they become family dogs or Air Force dog handlers, almost all of whom have themselves. Most Air Force enlisted personnel are only in the service for 3 to 5 years. So anyway, all right, that's it. Next week is safe spaces being run by not by Christian. So the question I got is, what are we doing in November? I have no clue.
What are some options?
Well, that's what I'm asking. What are some options? So I've already I told to the Christian Ed elders when we're trying to knock our heads together on this topic. Like, well, what do we want to do? And I'm like, if push comes to shove, I can come up with something. I got all kinds of stuff. Most of which I've chewed through some point in time, but I've been doing this now for so long because I stopped teaching the high school kids about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago. So my child became a high school kid. Discovered that you can't teach, parents can't teach their own children anything. All right. I've discovered over the years that I've been very influential as a high school teacher. I will say things and it make kids soaks into kids' heads. And they go, oh, that makes sense. That's smart. That's sound advice. If the parents go and say the exact same thing, it's wah, 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 wah. Oh, geez, mom. Anyway, so I did not want my kids to listen to sound advice from their parent because all they hear is wah, 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 wah. That one thing. So I stopped teaching them and I started teaching them. So I have tons of old material I can recycle again through here. Or we can do some new stuff. But so it's all the old stuff. I used to do a lot of stuff on Old Testament things. I did a whole section on the historical Jesus. I did a section on the Crusades. We won't go back and talk about Paul because that was relatively new. We won't go back and talk about the Reformation. That was relatively new. I did a whole section on the Book of Kings, trying to sort out all of those various kings and who we actually have archaeological evidence existed and things along that line. So we did that. We talked about, again, Old Testament and what portions of the Old Testament got carried over and influenced Jesus in terms of, so there's some Old Testament stuff that we don't equate with Christianity, like, oh, let's take your kids out back and stone them because, you know, according to Deuteronomy, if they disagree, kill your kid. You're perfectly allowed to do so under the rules of Deuteronomy, right? There are times. Mine's 21 now. Can we stop? No, let's take her out back and stone her. So there's just some of the stuff in the past that there's some particular topics. But one of the thing is when I brought this up to the CE elders, well, you know, if push comes to shove, we can't figure out something, I'll just cook up something and throw it up there. And in Virginia, you know, there might be such a thing as too much Bill.
Yeah.
I'm not saying one thing or the other. It wasn't so bad when we had enough people here to keep 3 classes going. So it was Doyle, and then I would do something, and then we had a 3rd class. But there is possible, you know, so that there's an alternative to Bill if there was too much Bill. So anyway, I'm not saying one thing or the other than the fact that even I would agree that maybe there's too much Bill. My style of teaching is not necessarily what everybody craves. Part of me goes, why not? The big ego part, you know. Everybody loves Bill. Everybody loves the way I teach, right? Right? And it's always a disappointment when I find out that that might not be the case. What? Surely not. So anyway, if you got ideas, pull me aside. Yes.
I think the historical Jesus would be interesting.
Oh, you want to try that one again? I love people who ask me to do stuff I've already done because then I don't have to work real hard.
Right. Did you do it recently?
I did it around 3. Well, that's the hard part about this. In a sense, is I did and then I didn't. Because recently is a weird word now under COVID. Right? I did it about 1.5 years before COVID. Now in their brains, that was 4 years ago. Yet in my brain, it feels like it was just yesterday.
Does anybody remember it? See, it's all new to us.
Okay, well, if everybody here's shaking their head when we talked about the historical Jesus, historical Jesus is really, really, I found it fascinating. Digging into the historical Jesus and that concept. It is a challenging concept to us Christians because when you start looking at Jesus as a historian would look at Jesus, the first thing you've got to do is start taking away the supernatural, which is rough for us because we believe in the supernatural. We believe that Jesus died on the cross and then rose again from the dead 3 days later. And a historian right from the get-go is trying to strip away all of that supernatural stuff. And so their concept is Jesus was some guy who got killed for being seditious. But if you start taking a look at what kind of sedition he was talking about, it's super duper interesting. And it aligns with the archaeology and the other historical sources that we have. That Jesus wasn't, you know, we talk about the Romans killing Jesus and the Jews killing Jesus, but Jesus was not preaching against Rome as much as Jesus was preaching against the collusion between the secular Jewish authorities of his time and their collusion with Rome and their inability to follow the law as written in the Old Testament. That's what he was arguing about as a historical figure. So if that's something that we want to get into, then we can get into that. Whether we do it in November or do it in the spring, I'll work with because did almost like 8 or 9 classes on it. It was extensive.
To me, if we believe Jesus was fully human as well as fully God, that it's worthy of study.
I think it's fascinating.
And I have read one book on it, but it was some time ago, so I don't remember that. Thank you, Bill.
Yep.